Bias is commonly defined as a preference in favor or against any thing, person, or group. We can also define bias as a systematic error, an error that's predictable under known circumstances and situations, leads to an incorrect assumption or behavior, and affects future decisions and judgments. These cognitive biases are efficient ways for us to think about the world. Some of these biases are social. They stem from how we think about ourselves in groups and about groups themselves. Many biases are cognitive. They can be related to how our memories work, how we think about likelihoods and probabilities, and how we reason through problems quickly. Alternatively, biases can be social, affecting how we think and behave in front of others. They change the way we think about others' emotions, behaviors, and whether we like or dislike other people. While fast, efficient thinking can be crucial for survival, it can also lead to poor outcomes when we weigh only what we learn first and do not weigh all of the other information at hand. So while biases do help us remember things more effectively, they can also lead to errors of memory and judgment by leading us to fill in gaps with a lot of guesswork when we don't possess additional, more reliable information. Consequently, our biases tend to get us into trouble with unintended consequences and outcomes. So it's important to take the time to figure out how they work. Confirmation bias is deeply ingrained in our normal, typical, daily cognitive functioning. While we don't necessarily question our existing beliefs, we do spend a lot of mental energy to make sure these beliefs are constantly confirmed with outside information. So rather than engage in this practice every day, humans have developed strategies both internally and externally to reduce this effort and keep our lives in full confirmation mode when consuming information. One way we unconsciously reduce our mental effort is by limiting our exposure to information that challenges our pre-existing thoughts and viewpoints. By doing this, we create information bubbles around ourselves. You may have heard these bubbles referred to as echo chambers. These are insulating. What better way to reduce mental effort than by getting rid of information that may cause us to have to engage in falsification? These information bubbles are getting smaller as technology grows more ubiquitous, making the bias even more pervasive. We are all inundated with information online, but we also have the options to control the information we're exposed to through preferences, filtering, defriending, and unfollowing. Unless we actively take steps to attempt to falsify the information that comes our way, this control almost becomes algorithmic, and in some cases is actually controlled by an artificial intelligence, leading to a confirming sphere of information. When in this sphere, this bubble or chamber, we don't have to vet or investigate the information we see. We vetted the sources and now we trust those sources. However, it doesn't mean this information is any good. It also means our attitudes and opinions become more polarized or galvanized toward the company we aim to keep. Itself a situation where our information search is only confirming, not falsifying. Another way confirmation bias appears is through our own memories. This is like interpreting things through a confirmatory lens. Most of the time, our memories are used to remember things that help keep us alive or advance us toward our goals. You can see where this bias might get us into trouble. There's no possible way we can remember or at least consciously access every single event or circumstance we have encountered in our lives. This is no different for confirmatory information. In fact, we're more likely to remember things that reinforce our experiences and expectations, even if we engage in a neutral fact-checking behavior. This phenomenon goes by a few names like selective recall, confirmatory memory, or access memory. I tend to like the descriptive power of the latter two because they more clearly reflect the bias as we've been discussing it. A third way confirmation bias appears is when information presented gets preference in your mind. If you come across information you haven't seen or heard before, the initial stuff ends up getting processed first and has more time to solidify into a belief or attitude. This is sometimes referred to as the irrational primacy effect. The effect occurs regardless of the importance of the information. Essentially, as you receive information, you immediately begin to form a belief or attitude, and subsequent information gets less weight than the information at the beginning, even if the later stuff is the more important info. Of course, a more rational response, using all the information equally to form an opinion, would be desirable, but confirmation bias gives the most weight to the stuff you encounter first. First equals most important for the most efficient thinking. A final way I want to mention, but this list is by no means exhaustive, is that of illusory associations or correlations between events. As humans, we like to notice patterns. If two events seem connected, well, we may make a potential illusory, not real, connection between them. Confirmation bias feeds our pattern-seeking and sense-making brains. There really isn't much you can do about its presence, and you wouldn't be able to make the many decisions you make every day without it. But recognizing when the bias occurs is the first battle. We test a rule by both confirming it and by attempting to disprove it. But here's the important point. Going through the steps to try to disprove or falsify is far more important than actually falsifying or failing to falsify. It's the process that matters. Pareidolia. This is a bias that causes us to see faces and recognizable shapes where they don't actually exist. Pareidolia is the tendency to perceive meaning from vague and random stimuli, usually in the things we see. The most common expression of pareidolia is perceiving faces in inanimate objects. This happens for a couple of reasons. The first is that the human mind is oriented to search for patterns in everything. Patterns mean something is predictable or regular. This is crucial for planning into the future or examining our memories. In fact, many cognitive biases we discuss in this course appear as the products of pattern making. But why are faces the most common pattern that our brain finds when searching for patterns? Well, imagine you're an early human trying to navigate the world. One thing you notice as you grow from a small human into a bigger one is that things that are alive, especially the ones that live on the land with you, have a predictable pattern of eye, nose, and mouth positions. You see two eyes, a central vertical line that breaks up the face, that's the nose, and a horizontal opening just below that. You see it in your family, you see it in the animals you eat, and you also see it in the animals that want to eat you. Actually, the last point is perhaps the most important, because prey animals tend to have eyes on the side of their heads. Look at a rabbit, for instance, which is a break from the general pattern I just described. Predators tend to look like people, with eyes facing forward. As with pattern seeking, the more often you see a pattern, the better you are at detecting and perceiving that pattern. If you see faces all the time, you get better at perceiving faces. Over time, the skill of seeing faces gets hardwired into our DNA as each passing generation sends that information about recognizing both the predator and prey faces onward. So not only is this pattern-seeking part of what makes you human, it also becomes important as your very large brain, compared to other animals, can handle more and more patterns as we grow, and it grows, and we experience more of the world. In our evolutionary history, Fine-tuned object recognition is extremely important to our survival, whether that object is a face, an edible species of mushroom, a feature of the landscape, or anything else you might need to discriminate in your lived environment. Anthropomorphism is the tendency to give non-human things, either living or non-living, human characteristics and human thought. It can even apply to abstract concepts like countries and weather, and not just to individual objects we see in the world. It's essentially thinking that any other thing that isn't human can and should have human qualities. Overall, the process of anthropomorphism is a bias because we use our existing organized knowledge, called schemas, to make inferences about the world around us. Because we engage with other humans most frequently, these schemas are the most accessible to us and are the ones we're most likely to apply when we encounter something new in our environment. However, the bias comes in because those inferences aren't always accurate. Using our knowledge of humans' intentions to make sense of the intentions or qualities of non-human things or concepts leads to mistakes. In the three-factor model, three concepts are identified. The first concept is called elicited agent knowledge. This has to do with how much prior knowledge about the subject or object a person has and how much of that knowledge is accessible. In other words, how easy is it to remember that prior knowledge? The second concept is referred to as affectance. How much do you want to interact with your current environment? Finally, the third concept involved with this model is called sociality, which is the need to establish social connections. The researchers showed that when elicited agent knowledge is low and affectance and sociality are high, people are more likely to anthropomorphize the subjects of discussion. Two group decision-making biases that have a real impact in all our individual lives are groupthink and group polarization. These group biases also have significant impacts on our personal biases. It's a two-way street. Groupthink is the tendency for a group to make poor decisions when there is very little or no discussion of alternative choices and the potential impact of the decision. This is because the main effort is to maintain harmony and conformity within the group. Groups that make biased decisions tend to not want to ruffle feathers. Instead, they want to conform and agree to the overarching perspective of the group. There are three main prerequisites that must coexist for groupthink to appear. The first prerequisite is high group cohesiveness. This is when everyone in the group values each person in the group and understands the strengths and weaknesses of the group members. If a group is already cohesive, then it is more likely to come up with a cohesive answer. This may sound like a good thing, but this high cohesiveness actually leads the group members to give up their individuality in the decision-making process to follow the thrust of the group. The second prerequisite involves what Aldag and Fuller called structural faults. These are the problematic elements existing in the group itself. One such problem is for the group to be insulated. The third and final prerequisite for groupthink to occur has to do with the situation itself. In a high-value situation or a highly emotional or charged decision, there is more pressure to conform to the overwhelming decision. Two aspects of group cohesiveness that lead to groupthink: invulnerability and over-optimism. He claimed that if a group thinks they are invulnerable to damage, bad press, or insulated by law, then this increases the chances of risk-taking, as well as over-optimism in those risky decisions, meaning that the group is more likely to believe their decision is the right one. This cohesion can also come from a feeling of moral superiority. If the group thinks their voice is the height of morality, then dissent from inside the group is ignored. Two characteristics of groupthink decision-making: closed-mindedness and stereotyping. He argued that closed-mindedness is the enemy to the kind of effective leadership that helps prevent groupthink. If a group member raises a warning in a groupthink situation, that warning may be dismissed and rationalized as insignificant. Furthermore, if this leads to the stereotyping of opposition within the group and turning the dissenters into caricatures that look or appear evil or weak, you've got an even larger problem. Closed-mindedness and stereotyping lead to an illusion of consensus in the group decision, because the group majority in any discussion could label a dissenter as weak or impotent. These people don't say anything. This is called self-censorship. Dissenters stay quiet. And even if this isn't the case, a dissenter speaks up, then there is extreme pressure from the group to stop fighting and accept the majority's decision. There might even be folks in the group that actively look for dissenters to silence them. How can we triumph over this group bias? Let's consider this question from two different angles. First, what can you do as a group member to stop groupthink? And then, how can you help create conditions that prevent groupthink from happening? Outside experts have a way of showing you new ways of thinking, and that's exceptionally crucial for evaluating a decision more fully. There's one aspect of groupthink that is quietly invading many aspects of our thinking, and we're often not aware of it. It's called group polarization, and it strongly affects a group that you probably engage with daily: social media. Group polarization is the tendency for a collective group's attitudes to shift toward more extreme positions when connected in a group of like-minded people. It happens in all of us when we share the same attitude at the same time. It's the consensus and the validation that comes from the consensus that strengthens our attitudes. Keep that circulating within a group, and you end up with a shift toward the extreme end of the attitude spectrum. When the attitude of a group shifts, the attitude of an individual within the group is likely going to shift too. We all want to feel a sense of belonging, especially if membership in a particular group is central to our own identity. It can be challenging to manage your relationship to group polarization, especially if you're in a group that is central to your identity and there's a shift to more extreme attitudes within it. But there are a few ways to help reduce the impact of the group's attitude on your own attitude. The first is to question members in your own group. Find out what their individual attitudes are. Then figure out how to use that dissent to foster discussion and improve decisions. Another way to reduce this group-based bias is to engage in out-group outreach. It is important to break out of your in-group bubble, which has the potential to become more polarized, and explore the differing attitudes of people outside of the group. Listen to members of the out-group, and try to figure out why they have those attitudes. The point here is to allow those perspectives in and not let your polarized attitude steamroll them. So the next time you're in a group, either making a decision or exploring your attitudes, make sure the changes we've discussed are present. That way, the time you spend in a group feels healthy and productive. Observer bias can appear under two different sets of conditions. First, it can arise when one observer reviews subjective criteria differently from another observer, meaning I see things differently than you do. Second, it can arise when the observer has preconceived or unconscious assumptions about the outcomes. The idea here is that even when people have the best intentions, these biases can bubble up to the surface, clouding our perceptions. So how do we overcome this limitation? Well, we have to remove the expectations. Whose expectations? Everyone's. Any situation where humans are the participants being studied has the possibility for preconceived ideas to run rampant. I'll leave you with a quote from the great Richard Feynman, which I think sums up the overall idea around observer bias. This long history of learning how not to fool ourselves, of having utter scientific integrity, is, I'm sorry to say, something that we haven't specifically included in any particular course that I know of. We just hope you've caught on by osmosis. The first principle of science is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. We're often blinded by our own biases, expectations, and preconceived notions. If we don't first recognize this before doing any science, either in a lab or in everyday life, there's not much we can conclude about our world. Reducing bias starts with each of us. The fundamental attribution error, or FAE. This bias is defined as the tendency to attribute other people's behavior to their inherent qualities, like their traits and mental abilities, and to attribute your own behaviors to circumstances and situational influences. Before we go any further, we should probably define what an attribution is. Simply put, an attribution is a causal explanation for another person's behavior. We aren't in other people's heads, like we are in our own. So we really can't know for sure why someone did the thing they did. We have to come up with reasons. The big difference you'll notice here is that you have access to your own thoughts. So figuring out why you did the thing you did is a bit easier. There are two components to attributions. How often does this person engage in this behavior? And is the cause of the behavior based on some inherent quality of the person, such as weight or hair color, or due to some external situational reason? So even though the tendency of the fundamental attribution error is to attribute other people's behavior to their disposition, it also includes an overcorrection for situational factors related to our own behaviors. You can think of this bias as a two-parter, an overgeneralization of others' behaviors and our own. Remember, when we make attributions, we're coming up with reasons why someone, or us, behave the way that we did. The fundamental attribution error is a knee-jerk judgment about people. It's the main justification for the fundamental attribution error, because if we think people get what they deserve, then it's probably something about who they are on the inside, their disposition, that led to the comeuppance. Poor behavior, as the result of bad disposition, should be met with justice. Another reason for the fundamental attribution error is how salient the behavior of the actor is. Saliency is a fancy word for how much something attracts and holds our attention. The more salient something is, like a person or a person's behavior, the more attention we will pay it. This is a crucial part of the bias, because we aren't able to pay equal attention to everybody or how they're behaving. This is called actor-observer asymmetry. Only when a behavior of someone in a crowd is out of the ordinary, or a person is the only one around, will you try to think about attributions. In the end, we have access to our own thoughts, but not anyone else's. We only see or hear what they're doing. We have to start making inferences about the inside stuff, and that's where the bias gets us into trouble. We engage in a self-fundamental attribution error when we characterize our successes as part of our dispositional qualities. On the other hand, we tend to characterize our failures as the result of external circumstances. It's called the self-serving bias. These two biases have the capacity to get us into trouble, but there are ways to rely on them less in our interactions with others. First, as is the case with many biases, is to stop and reflect before making judgments about others, or even your own, behaviors. This is especially important if you come to a misplaced dispositional conclusion as your first reason for someone's behavior. Explore the situation a little more. When making an attribution about another person or yourself, you need to explore both dispositional and situational reasons for the behavior. Get as much information as possible before you make a judgment about a person's behavior, or frankly, even your own. Another trick is to examine your own mood before assigning attributions. This takes a bit more time, obviously, because in the time it takes to examine your mood, you may have already fired off an attribution. When you're in a negative mood, you tend to turn inward, focusing more on your own state rather than the states of others. This will typically shut off the fundamental attribution error and reduce dispositional attributions for others. It might also flip the script on the self-serving bias too. On the other hand, being in a good mood tends to increase the fundamental attribution error. Why would being happy do that? Well, you tend to ignore how you're feeling and spend more time interpreting your own circumstances. The misinformation effect reflects our tendency to trust our memories regardless of what they are. And what makes this bias especially hard to deal with is that we trust our memories even when they're impacted by the actions of others. The misinformation effect occurs because we think our memories accurately reflect what happened. But they don't. They reflect some of what happened, but they're also influenced by our emotions, our expectations, our culture, and importantly, what others have to say about them. Despite this, eyewitness testimony is one of the most frequent and relied upon forms of testimony and evidence used in civil and criminal trials in the United States. Overall, the general public tends to consider eyewitness memories more reliable than they really are. Eyewitnesses are prone to having their memories influenced by those around them, leading them to accept misinformation as fact. We don't remember everything about a situation, even when it's important information, and what we do end up remembering can be modified after the fact. Information about a co-witness's credibility can change how witnesses reconstruct their own memories. So if you're told that another witness is particularly credible, you might think, hey, they must know what they're talking about, so why don't I just trust them and agree with what they said? But what if what you're affirming isn't true? Our memories are also affected by the presence of weapons in an altercation. The weapons capture our attention, which can change the way we remember details after they happen. I have a few tips to mitigate the effects of memory issues associated with the misinformation effect. One way is to change the way we think about events so that we reduce our reliance on post-event information to recall our memories. If after witnessing a crime you tell yourself that your memory or perceptions are strong and you trust them, you'll be less likely to rely on external information that may or may not be correct. That's great news, but it only works if you do the affirmations in real time. Another way you can reduce errors related to memory is simply by knowing that they exist. That simply warning participants against possible memory errors reduce the occurrence of these errors and specifically reduced reliance on post-event information. Simply put, the misinformation effect virtually disappeared. But bear in mind that being warned about a bias doesn't necessarily mean it's present. Assuming that can lead to what's called the tainted truth effect, in which you make errors thinking you're preventing errors. So if you think you'll need to recall an event with great accuracy later, the best thing you can do is write down everything you have witnessed as soon as possible. You're probably familiar with the phrase, hindsight is 20/20. This phrase represents the fact that our ability to know and understand the past is as clear as normal vision. The bias is a bummer. We're tricked. We trick ourselves into thinking we knew more than we really did at the time of some event, even though some reflection can show that's highly unlikely. When we look back on a past event, it's easy to piece together information that wasn't available to us at the time and say we should have known. But often this simply isn't the case. As a result, I tend to think that hindsight bias causes us to put our feet in our mouths more often than it's helpful. Now, hindsight bias is defined as the tendency for people to interpret past events as being more predictable than they were in reality. Our feeling of knowing it all along can only be interpreted through a past tense lens. Our own hindsight is more likely to appear when events are tragic, especially if they seem avoidable. People begin to form opinions on those two features, predictability and avoidability, using information that only became knowable after the event occurred. This is sometimes a confusing bias because it can look like our memory performing its usual function. Our memory allows us to use past information to help us with future decisions. The bias comes about because we use this old information to discuss what we know now that we didn't know then. In reality, the future is only somewhat regular and predictable, but in hindsight, it looks totally predictable. Clearly, it's a pervasive bias. But why does it occur? What's its function? There are three popular models that describe and explain its function and occurrence. For the most part, the models and explanations invoke a mix of probability judgments and memory distortions. Whenever we make probability judgments, we make anchors. Anchors serve as starting points. If a boat has its anchor down, it won't go anywhere. The journey begins where the boat is anchored. That's how thinking anchors work, and they're usually numeric. These anchors are also merely estimates of actual probabilities. That's because we usually don't have knowledge of actual probabilities. The anchors are used for all future estimates too. So when you go to use the probability estimates to make a judgment or decision, the anchors are there, ready to help you make those judgments or decisions more efficiently and quickly. One important thing to note about memory is that it is reconstructive. By this I mean that it's never only what actually happened. Rather, it's what happened plus all the other stuff in our heads. So memory is distorted. When you retrieve those anchors from your memory, they're changed and distorted by what actually happened. Because your memories are controlled by associations between events, your existing knowledge, and your perceptions, stronger associations between these things are easier to remember than weaker ones. It's that favoring of stronger associations over the weaker ones during memory retrieval that causes us to make errors. This model is called SARA, which stands for Selective Activation and Reconstructive Anchoring. Another model suggests that the appearance of hindsight bias is related to how much previous knowledge of a subject a person has. We'll call this foresight knowledge. So if you have comprehensive knowledge on a subject, the bias tends to occur less frequently. This is because more alternatives and possibilities are available in your mind well before any event occurs, so whatever winds up happening is less of a surprise. But the second model does explain decisions made by novices without special expertise in a field. When we don't have the necessary foresight knowledge, then we rely on shortcuts that can be right or wrong. And if they're wrong, well, Hindsight's 2020. This model is called RAFT, which stands for Reconstruction After Feedback with Take the Best heuristic. A heuristic is a thinking shortcut, sort of like a rule of thumb. Take the best essentially means that between any two choices, I'm going to go with the one that I think is the best alternative. This is what RAFT explores, how we constantly learn new information that replaces old information, which makes memory far more efficient, but not more accurate. Thus, hindsight bias appears when we use that new information to reconstruct how we originally arrived at the answer. The final model has to do with how we make probability judgments in general, which feed into hindsight bias. Generally, it explains that people don't have a good handle on making probability judgments. Your expectation of an event, its probability of happening, and the actual event occurring might be way different. But that's before the event actually occurs. This discrepancy likely falls into hindsight bias because the event did eventually happen. We adjust our probabilities of the event happening to 100% at that point. Our memories are further distorted. Another reason people make probability judgment errors is something called motivated forgetting. We don't like being wrong. And even when we're wrong, we don't want to accept responsibility for being wrong. We're motivated to adjust our thinking about the event to convince ourselves that we knew the outcome all along. When the outcome is negative, we might also engage in retroactive pessimism, where we just shrug and say, oh well, there was just no way to prevent it. It's a way to regulate our disappointment about an outcome we don't like. But of course, we generally can't predict the future, so many times when positive or negative events occur, we tend to be surprised regardless. It's only natural to be surprised by unpredictable events. Let's define surprise. Surprise is a metacognitive emotion. This means we generally express the emotion after becoming aware of the surprising information. Secondly, surprise is also a biasing emotion. Because we've engaged our sense-making mission, we're going to explore our memories. I've mentioned several times in this lecture that memory is immediately biasing because of how memories get reconstructed. It is important for us to know if surprise is the appropriate emotion for the circumstance. Finally, the last piece of thinking we engage in when interpreting our surprise is figuring out how close we were to predicting the outcome we observed. Usually, the more surprised we are, the worse we were at predicting the outcome. Therefore, we have to engage in more hindsight bias to make up the difference. So, what can you do to decrease the effects of hindsight bias? Well, there's good news and bad news. Let me give you the bad news first. Like many biases, hindsight bias has a function or purpose. Our brains require resources for every thought we generate, so we need to be efficient about thinking so we use the least amount of resources. This is called thinking efficiency. Because this bias helps us to think more efficiently, it's unlikely that you'll ever be able to completely eliminate hindsight bias from your thinking and decisions. In fact, some researchers argue that hindsight bias is incredibly valuable for humans' ability to update any existing information we might have. Taken that way, it's not necessarily a bad thing that you can't get rid of it completely. And even people who say they're actively trying to reduce the impact of hindsight bias do still show it. There's no solution that gets rid of it completely. But there's some good news. If you ever feel compelled to say, I knew it all along, stop yourself and reflect on alternative reasons or hypotheses and how they might be correct instead. For example, you could say to yourself, I could never have expected this to happen. This is called a reverse hindsight bias. Some events, even tragic ones, are extremely hard to predict. If we repeat this to ourselves, perhaps hindsight won't have as much influence on our thinking. It's only human to attempt to make sense of an outcome, especially a horrible or tragic one. It's only human to not want to feel negatively about an event. And if it is truly not your fault, it's only human to not want to take responsibility. These negative feelings and the surprise that comes out of unpredictable events are necessary for survival. It tells us not to do something again. We learned. We can now apply this new knowledge. We don't want to make the same mistake twice. This new information allows us to make better inferences and decisions in the future. But at the same time, I think that's what makes the bias so unhelpful. People would rather talk about knowing it all along instead of just putting in the work to prevent the same outcome from occurring again, especially if it's something that can be changed. And on the flip side, it's important to remember when something truly isn't your fault, so you don't take on the misplaced guilt. They're called unpredictable events and outcomes for a reason. In this lecture, we're going to discuss the gambler's fallacy and its sister, the hot hand fallacy. These two biases concern how you perceive independent, in other words, disconnected events. The first is about your bad luck. The second is about your good fortune. Let's play. I want to start with the gambler's fallacy. This is the tendency to believe, incorrectly, that any particular random chance event, especially in games of chance, is connected to previous events. In reality, the odds of any random event happening are exactly the same each time. But this false belief that past events will skew future results leads to behavior called perseveration. It creates the illusion that previous events, which are all independent roles, subject to the laws of physics, will influence and impact future events. That's the essence of the gambler's fallacy. But what makes people rely on these past events to make their betting decisions in the present? According to this law, people think that a small sample of outcomes represents a larger set of outcomes. It's called gambler's fallacy for a reason. People mistakenly believe that there's some external force, the universe, that isn't random and thus can be controlled. It also reflects an erroneous belief that alternating or definable patterns in decisions is a desirable outcome. And, to boot, studies have shown that even when falling into the fallacy results in negative consequence, punishments, it doesn't completely remove the fallacy from our thinking. Okay, but what if the outcomes are good? What if we don't alternate decisions for the sake of alternating or because we believe that long streaks of anything are in some way bad? The hot hand fallacy is in some ways the opposite of the gambler's fallacy. If the gambler's fallacy tends to be a focus on losing streaks within the law of small numbers, or the false belief that the universe somehow guides outcomes, then the hot hand fallacy is the focus on good outcomes strung together. More formally, the fallacy or bias is defined as the belief that if a person experiences a string of successful outcomes, they will continue to experience successful outcomes. A few other biases play some bit roles here with the hot hand. The first is confirmation bias, the tendency to accept information that conforms to our pre-existing beliefs, which implicitly or unconsciously directs us to look for awesome streaks of good outcomes, precisely because we believe, erroneously, in the existence of streaks. The second is illusion of control, the belief that we have control over external forces, which convinces us that this pattern making must be impacted by our own influence on the environment. In other words, we believe the person on the hot streak has control over all aspects of their continuing good fortune. I think by now I've hit the point home that the laws of physics cannot be influenced in the ways gamblers and hot hand fallacies would lead you to believe. Of a psychological concept called self-validation. This is a mental operation that we all rely on to recognize or validate our self-worth. It includes accepting things about our internal experience, like our thoughts and feelings, rather than external experience. Self-validation is one way we justify we matter and the things we do matter. All human beings have biased minds. So any justification or validation that comes from our own minds should be considered a tad suspect. It's an innate part of how our brains work, but when the forces of self-validation and gullibility combine, you get the bias we'll be discussing in this lecture. Foer's work in the field has led some researchers to call this bias the Foer effect. Other researchers call it the Barnum effect. Yep, that Barnum, P.T. Barnum, the circus promoter and showman. He's famous for saying, "There's a sucker born every minute." And though there's no evidence he ever said it, it's often attributed to him. Psychologist Paul Meehl coined this bias the Barnum effect because it appears when we hear a statement that could be true of anyone. The first thing con artists have is an air of confidence. All they have to do is believe what they're doing is real, and people will trust and believe them. Next, they'll use charts and figures to make you think that whatever they're pitching is more reputable than you might think. They might also employ some sort of gimmick. For example, a financial con man might tell you that they use a proprietary algorithm to figure out how to invest your money. A psychic might read your palm or use a crystal ball. They'll even make sure to know what you're wearing and reference that in their shtick, such as commenting on a woman's earrings or a man's suit. Anything to make you feel like the most important person in the world at that moment. Finally, to achieve that importance, they'll use flattery. This is one of the older social influence tricks. I'm sorry to say this, but if someone is flattering you, you might want to think twice about whether they want something from you or not. Con artists need you to actively go along with their schemes, so flattery is a perfect technique. All the rest of the stuff I mentioned is extra flair, because flattery gets your foot in the door most of the time. But all of that is, like I said, meant to make you feel important, validated. Of course, you might think you're important, and so this con artist or huckster is attempting to highlight that by validating you. Oops, there's that word again. You might think, I'll never get duped. But these biases and effects are extremely common and often far more subtle than the examples I've shared so far. Credibility gives us a reason to trust the huckster or con artist. If we believe what they're selling, we're more likely to give them our money. Another reason we get duped by this bias is that we love hearing about our positive traits, but we often don't like to admit that we even have negative traits. When people are asked to rate how well positive versus negative personality traits apply to them, they will accept the positive traits but reject the negative ones. One last way we're influenced by this bias is if the message is personalized to us. So what do we do? How do we avoid getting conned? Knowing how Barnum's statements work is half the battle. The desire to conform and the Foer effect are dangerous because you might think it's your only option to agree with the huckster's pitch. Everybody is doing it, so why should I be different? Astrologers, fortune tellers, and other psychic practitioners are usually looking for one thing only: your money. It might be easy to say, I'm not that gullible, and you know, you might not be that gullible. But just know that the Barnum-Forer effect weasels its way into the simplest of decisions. We all want to feel validated. I want to be validated in my thoughts and behaviors too. Beware that feeling if someone else is asking you to self-validate. That's subtly different from that person validating you directly. They get you by flattery. Then you get the self-validation from whatever they say next. So what is a stereotype? It's a generalization that is made about members of a group. A group here is defined as two or more people who share a common attribute, characteristic, or behavior. These can be ethnic groups, dance groups, hairstyle groups, athletic groups, the list goes on and on. The point here is that the stereotype is a generalization of a part of a group. How a person from that group looks, what they're wearing, what they do, or even how they sound, to the entire group itself. So just because one observation occurs, the rest of the group gets the attribute and the stereotype. We stereotype constantly. Why do we do it? Well, it all comes down to our spectacular ability to categorize, the representativeness heuristic. It's a quick shortcut to help us determine group membership of any particular object or person. If we detect a resemblance of something old to something new, we are inclined automatically to assign that new person to an existing category in our brains. But the representativeness heuristic is just a thinking shortcut that usually yields the right answer. That's the underlying function of stereotyping, to quickly categorize. However, this doesn't explain how these stereotypes themselves manifest, especially in their more common harmful aspects. Stereotypes have a direct pipeline into our prejudice. That's the emotional component of this bias, usually negative. There are many explanations for why humans use stereotyping, so I'm going to focus on two that have a large body of observation and research behind them. The first is called the kernel of truth hypothesis. The name comes from the corn kernel, of course. One corn kernel is part of a larger whole, the full ear of corn. This idea stems from the fact that a stereotype doesn't seem to be born out of thin air. Rather, someone witnessed a group member exhibiting the stereotype, and the observation spread far and wide, gaining a caricature-like quality, all based on the simple observed so-called truth. The point I really want to make is just because there might be a kernel of truth doesn't mean the stereotype isn't mean, rude, or harmful to the group in question. Stereotypes might seem innocuous, but real harm can be generated from them. The second explanation comes from a classic statistical issue. Stereotypes could be the result of an illusory correlation. This is when a single instance of a behavior or trait in a group member is thought to be related to the inherent qualities of the group. However, the relationship is merely an illusion. It's an illusion because everything we interact with in our environment is the result of our internal perceptual abilities. We don't necessarily see the world for what it is, but rather what our brain thinks it is. The human brain is always looking for patterns. And because of this, we tend to see patterns where patterns don't actually exist. And once we have established a new pattern in our own brain, we begin to test this hypothesis by observing other group members. Classic examples of two additional group biases that feed stereotypes. The first is called in-group bias. This is when a person in a group favors the perceived members of this group more than anyone perceived to be outside it. Out-group bias. This is the idea that everyone who isn't perceived to be a member of the in-group is part of the out-group. In other words, everyone else. And that anything any group member does or looks like is the same for anyone else in the out-group. This is also called a homogeneity bias. because the bias dictates to us that everyone in the outgroup is the same. The interesting thing about the outgroup bias is that while we think the members of the outgroup are homogeneous, we think that members of our in-group are as diverse and individual as ever. It's quite the stark difference when we attempt to compare ourselves to others. When you give people a stereotype to use as a dagger, they will wield it against those outside their group, even if they're in constant contact with members of the outgroup and must live amongst one another. So how do we reduce stereotyping and the resulting prejudice? It is my philosophy that it isn't enough just to mention these biases. By behaving and thinking in ways contrary to the tendencies that give rise to biases, we can actively reduce their impact. One such idea is to create a shared goal among groups, so that the groups must cooperate to achieve the goal. If you have now gotten to know people from the outgroup, and you explore their values, their dreams, their goals, and their hardships, you quickly see that you are no different. The stereotype no longer retains the kernel of truth, no longer has the illusory relationship you first saw and thought. Cooperation among folks dissolves the stereotypes and resulting prejudice. When you reduce conflict in groups, it has a sobering effect on the use of stereotypes and prejudice. It's a slow process, to be sure, but it's a place to start. People have a tendency to overestimate their own ability on any given task. And the lower your ability, the higher your tendency to overestimate. This is called the Dunning-Kruger Effect. It's a combination of low ability on a task and high confidence in a favorable outcome. In the 1999 study of this subject, which gave the effect its name, psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger asked participants to perform several tasks. In each of these tasks, they asked the participants to evaluate their own performance before the participants received any feedback on how they'd done. Instead of asking participants about subjective domains like comedy, they had the participants solve logic problems, then rate how well they knew the subject and also how they perceived they did on the test itself. The people who scored in the lowest 25 percentile thought they performed decently on the logic test and thought their logic ability was fairly decent. The kicker? The folks in the lowest percentile groups actually thought their logic test performance and their logic ability was higher than the third quartile group. At the same time, the people who performed better than 50% on the logic test, up to 75%, stated their ability and perceived performance was worse than the people who actually did worse. The first part of the Dunning-Kruger bias requires low task knowledge or ability. The other piece is confidence in our existing knowledge, regardless of behavioral outcomes. It turns out, regardless of the amount of feedback or incentives to improve, low task ability performers couldn't break out of their own lack of understanding or their lack of competence in a given domain. The researchers argued that subjects' low task ability essentially blocks their receptiveness to insight into their own shortcomings and to recognizing where their deficits might be. There's at least one explanation of why the bias occurs. It first begins with an inability to think about your own thinking. That's called metacognition. And if you don't have the self-awareness to think about your own thinking, you aren't going to find the holes in your knowledge that need to be filled. Culture also plays a role in our susceptibility to the bias. Western culture is individualistic, which means we place a high degree of importance on the individual rather than on the group. In collectivistic cultures, where the group is considered more important than the individual, the Dunning-Kruger effect disappears. The explanation for this appears to be based on how underperforming on a task relates to social group value. In other words, if I perform poorly on a task in this culture, I'd see it as an opportunity to show my worth by engaging in improving. Individualistic cultures don't have this aspect. Erlanger and colleagues offer some paths to reduce the appearance of the bias. First and foremost, encourage learning at all ages, but especially in young children. The younger you start, the better metacognition becomes. Another solution is to encourage what's called a growth mindset. This is the idea from Carol Dweck and others that suggests encouraging students to think that our traits, including mental traits, are changeable. You're not stuck with a specific kind of brain or mind or intelligence. You can change it. On the other side of the knowledge coin is the bias that experts can exhibit. The curse of knowledge. It's a dramatic name for a relatively mundane but important bias. This is the tendency for a high-ability person, an expert in a domain like astronomy or chemistry or cognitive biases, to unwittingly assume others have the same or requisite background to understand their area of expertise as well as they do. A memory bias called false memories. This bias makes us think that related ideas and concepts, many times from sources outside of our own minds, are actual memories. The current testing method for investigating false memories is called the DRM method because it was developed by psychologist James Deese in 1959 and then updated in 1995 by psychologists Henry Roediger III and Kathleen McDermott. For the purposes of this demonstration, I will use a simpler, modified version of the test. I'm going to say 10 words aloud. Try your best to remember the words, but do not write anything down. Okay, ready? Here they are. Waves, sand, surf, sun, frisbee, bikini, towel, ocean, boat, tan. In the actual DRM method, participants were asked to watch a computer screen with words flashing on the screen every second or so. Participants were simply asked to remember as many words as possible for the next section. After participants studied the words, usually around 40, they were given a distractor task for a period of a minute or more. After the delay, the participants moved into the testing phase of the experiment. During this phase, participants were shown one word at a time and were asked if the word was one they saw during the learning phase, marking it as old, or if it was a new word that they hadn't seen in the learning phase, marking it as new. Some of the new words are called critical lures. These critical lures are crucial for researchers to determine if something can make it into your brain that you think you have experienced. Okay, my last question for you. Just say to yourself yes or no. Was the word beach on the list I said out loud to you at the beginning of the demo? If you said no, you're correct. But if you said yes, don't beat yourself up. When I do this demo in my classes, I usually get about a quarter of the class remembering that the word beach was on the list. Why would so many people remember the word beach when it wasn't actually on the list? Well, it's because the list contained thematic beach-going words like sand, bikini, and waves. The whole list was organized to activate the idea of beach in your mind as you continued to try to remember the words. Maybe you even kept repeating beach to yourself because the words were beach-themed. Remember, biases are tendencies for thinking and behaviors. You're merely at the whim of supposed details conjured up by a mind that really only remembers the gist of situations and not every detail. Even when you're asked to give details, false memories can bias the results. So how does the bias of false memory work? Plausibility. Plausibility is all about how possible something seems. If it seems possible, then it's plausible. It means it could happen, right? The DRM method is able to seemingly implant false memories because it seems possible that the critical lure could have been a word you saw during the learning phase. Cryptomnesia is defined as the tendency for a person to falsely remember generating a thought, an idea, or even a joke as a new inspiration, conjured from their own mind. It's a bias because of what researchers have referred to as a source monitoring error. A source monitoring error is a problem with storing the source of the information along with the information itself. For example, you might remember a story or tune, but not remember who sang the song or wrote the story, or even what the title of the song or story is. So how do we reduce the impact of these biases on our lives? The best strategy to protect yourself from falling victim to false memories is to not let others manage your memories. Of course, when we have experiences with other people, we want to share our memories of that experience with them. But I urge you not to offload those memories onto other people. Let me give you an example using a line of memory research that focuses on collective experiences. The memories themselves of these collective experiences are referred to as flashbulb memories due to the vivid images, filled with a flash of light to expose every aspect, just like an old-timey camera that needed a giant flashbulb to help with the film exposure. Most people contend that these memories are some of the strongest they have because of the vividness. But study after study shows that people generally lose details of these experiences and memories just like they do for run-of-the-mill memories. What doesn't change, however, is our confidence in these memories. We still believe in the vividness our minds create around these flashbulb memories. Because these memories tend to be shared and repeated over and over again, false memories can creep in. This is what I mean about offloading memories. Eventually, through repetition of our experiences to others, as well as listening to memories of others' experiences, we may end up with memories that are plausible, but not actually what we experienced on that day. Even if you try to prevent false memories from forming, you may still end up with a sense that you experienced something that never actually happened to you, perhaps through a feeling of familiarity, like déjà vu. Belief bias is the tendency to judge arguments on the believability of their conclusions, or their plausibility, rather than the whole argument. In a logical argument, each of the pieces of an argument support the conclusion, but we sometimes accept an illogical argument when the conclusion seems plausible to us. That is to say, we aren't following along with the logical steps in the argument, we're buying into the general idea that the argument seems believable or plausible at the end. This is called a plausibility judgment, and it often happens when the argument lines up with our prior beliefs, current worldview, or preconceptions. It's an extremely common bias, even if it's not immediately identifiable. We all tend to rely on it to varying extents. The first step in identifying belief bias is to understand how a logical argument works. Logic is a systematic study of the rules of inference. An inference is simply the next step in a line of reasoning. We gather information from the natural world and our observations, then carry forward that information to the next step. Logic is the set of rules that describe the stepping forward in our line of thought. First and foremost, the best strategy to reduce the impact of this bias is to slow down. Reflect on how an entire argument, not just a conclusion, works. It seems counterintuitive to our evolutionary history to slow down. But because life is becoming more complex than it was when our biases formed on the evolutionary timescale, slowing down is crucial. And considering our evolutionary history brings me to my next point. We have these biases to help us think quickly and efficiently. The idea I'm talking about is called dual process thinking. Essentially, the idea is that you have two different but parallel types of thinking. One type is the fast, automatic, and heuristic processing. Heuristics are mental shortcuts. This is where many of your biases are formed to keep you thinking and moving quickly from event to event. The other thinking process is slow, deliberate, and logical. You see, the last word there is the operative word for that kind of processing. Thus, if you stop the heuristic process where belief bias lives, you're more likely to start the logical, deliberative processes. But the most important thing to recognize is that logic was created by humans, and so it's a skill that must be learned. Some of it comes naturally, as this is how we have observed the universe to work, but it's a skill to recognize the many nuanced forms that exist. If you're taught to invoke this form of processing, the belief bias effect dissipates. The cognitive bias known as the peak end rule. This is the cognitive bias that causes you to judge an experience based on how you felt at the most intense, positive or negative moments, the peaks, as well as how the experience ended, instead of basing it on the experience as a whole, or the average of every moment in your experience to create your memory of it. The bias plays an important role in everyday life because it affects how you recall memories, how you describe your life experiences to others, and the future judgments and decisions you may make based on this biased information. Memories are always accompanied by the emotions we feel during an experience and how we feel about the experience after the fact. Most memories have multiple emotions associated with them, but there can be dominating emotions. For instance, one emotion, like happiness or sadness, can be the dominant feeling associated with the memory. When discussing emotions in a scientific sense, it's important to describe two features. The first feature is the type of emotion, or its valence. Think of valence on a continuum, with extremely positive emotions, like exuberance and joy, at one end. And on the other side of the continuum are extremely negative emotions, like sorrow and despair. Of course, as with any continuum, there are points all along the middle. In the exact center, we can characterize valence as zero, or no emotional content. This is sometimes referred to as neutral in the research. The second feature of emotions is intensity. Essentially, this means how much of the emotion did you feel at the time of the event or experience. Again, we have a continuum, with zero intensity reflecting no intensity or no emotional feeling at one extreme, with the increasing values of intensity reflecting just how strongly the emotion is felt, leading to the most extreme feeling possible at the other end. People generally don't focus on these two features when discussing events amongst themselves. We've developed words that fold the valence and intensity together. For example, contentment versus elation. These two emotions are generally associated with positive valence, but elation would definitely carry more intensity than contentment. Let's use the terms valence and intensity to compare two different emotions. Say sadness and exuberance. Sadness is a negative feeling with low intensity. Exuberance is a positive emotion with high intensity. What does a negative and high intensity emotion look like? Anger, or perhaps fury. Try to think of some other words that describe emotions and see how you define them in terms of valence and intensity. This concept is crucial to understanding the peak end rule. Many of our daily experiences don't warrant remembering. Our brains really don't need to remember these zero valence or low intensity experiences because they aren't useful for the future. For example, if you work a job composed of many repetitive activities, like a desk job or manufacturing job, you may have the experience of slight amnesia on a daily basis because you never really remember doing one task over the other. Our brains are really good at making things that require no emotional input fairly automatic. However, throw in emotional valence and intensity, and you get a situation that your brain thinks warrants encoding and storing away for future use. Interestingly, The phenomenon of nostalgia can help us understand how the peak-end rule operates. Nostalgia is the idea of remembering fondly the aspects of a time in the past that are no longer present. In other words, nostalgia is specifically about past experiences and memories that brought us an amount of joy. It also signals a motivation to return to that time. Here, again, we're looking at the two major reasons that the peak-end rule dominates our memory recall. First, we just have a tendency to remember events with emotional aspects to them. And second, we have a memory bias towards things that happened most recently. In this case, the end part of the peak-end rule comes from the fact that the emotional quality at the end of an experience is, by definition, the most recent thing about the experience. Because we best remember things that happened most recently, of course, we're also likely to have a memory of the emotional quality of the end, too. When asked to specifically think of the end of an event and the emotions and feelings those bring about, or if not prompted at all, those feelings will impact future decisions. When you ask somebody to think of the beginning, decisions are much different, precisely because feelings were different at the beginning than at the end of the experience. Okay, but what about experiences that last several days? How do we remember them? Well, it depends on what happens during those several days. In other words, the peak-end rule may not explain your overall thoughts of a vacation or extended holiday, but how you feel at the end of the experience may impact how you remember the vacation for years. A cognitive bias called survivorship bias. This is the tendency to focus on the people or objects that have moved past some defined selection process, and to overlook those people or things that did not make it past that selection process. The second part of the bias typically occurs because of the lack of visibility of the people or objects after the selection process. Let's first set up the basics of the bias. First, when confronted with the selection process, people tend to ignore other outcomes of a situation. Second, people are generally overly optimistic about what life has in store because we always observe the survivors of various selection criteria. If we only focus on survivors of the selection process, well, shoot, everything seems like sunshine and rainbows. If we focused on those that didn't survive the many selection processes that people face every day, we may start to feel that life isn't worth living. While that last part is a bit of an exaggeration, it does feed into the second part of the bias. The third basic aspect of the bias is that most of the time, people aren't very good at making judgments that are based on probabilities or likelihoods because we don't like to think about the odds that something bad will happen. The underlying logic is that if you don't accurately account for the experience of those that don't survive, whatever or whomever we're talking about, then you're not getting the full picture of the experience. This could be detrimental to decisions and outcomes. Survivorship bias is literally everywhere, and it sometimes changes the way we see where we've come from. It can also lead us to believe that there could have been no other path to get where we've ended up. The explanation for the desire to go through with the contested plans or behaviors rests in a bias called reactance. It's also a motivational state because it causes us to act. The reactance bias is the tendency to act in ways that are opposite to the rules and regulations that are in place. In other words, if restrictions are placed upon you that you feel are impinging on your freedom, you are going to act in a way that actively flouts those restrictions. Because of that, this bias appears when you are explicitly told not to do something that you think you should be able and allowed to do. Brehm found in his research that his participants were just as likely to be aroused, angered, when the freedoms that were taken away were real or perceived. The last word is incredibly important in social psychology and a social bias like reactance. Lots of real things happen to us in social situations, and we have thoughts and behaviors that can be inferred or observed by others. But we also imagine situations that could have happened or that might happen in the future. That's where the perceived part comes in. And in the case of reactance bias, it's clear that we engage this bias even when the removal of freedoms is hypothetical. It's an incredibly powerful motivational tool that spurs us to act. And when we act, those behaviors are in service of regaining what we lost, because we think the freedom that was lost was ours to begin with. One principle in social influence, getting people to do what we want them to do, is called compliance. Compliance comes in many forms, from what the government asks or compels you to do, to simple social interactions between individuals. One strategy in compliance syncs well with reactance bias. It's colloquially referred to as reverse psychology. Essentially, reverse psychology is the technique to get someone to do or say something by saying that you don't want them to do or say it, even though you actually do want them to do or say that thing. Importantly, compliance techniques work best when the target, in this case, someone displaying reactance bias, is unaware that they are the target of compliance techniques. If you begin to use reverse psychology in an open way, it will be immediately detected and backfire. This is one of those biases that operates mostly in the dark recesses of your subconscious. Most of the time, you won't recognize your reactance until someone either specifically calls it out or you catch on to some reverse psychology attempt. So what are some strategies to mitigate reactance? First, remember that many freedoms are social contracts and constructs. That means humans created them to maintain order and harmony from a certain perspective, and as members of society, we all agree in some unstated contractual way to act within these limits. Sometimes we do things that others don't like and realize that our actions violate this contract. Another strategy that reduces reactance bias is reflecting on which freedoms are actually freedoms, and what just makes sense to prolong your life and the lives of those around you and in your care. The question you ask yourself in this case is the limitation worth resisting? Illusory correlations, or things we think are connected, but really have nothing to do with each other. We engage in these behaviors because we have a belief that the behavior or even rituals of multiple behaviors in a prescribed order will have some impact on future outcomes, near or far. They're tied to good fortune and a desire to avoid bad luck. Why do we cling to these superstitious beliefs and rituals? It's because of a pernicious bias that feeds not only superstitions, but many other biases and behaviors. It's called the status quo bias. This is the tendency to prefer the current state of affairs in your life and in the world around you. These behaviors and beliefs are representative of a false belief that we have about nature, that we can control it ourselves. In psychology, this false belief is called the illusion of control. The illusion of control is a good description for how many of our cognitive and social biases continue to affect our behavior, even when we think we have a handle on them. It also allows them to work unimpeded with deliberate, logical counterthoughts. All because we think, erroneously, that we can control things without direct manipulation. The illusion of control tells us we are the masters of our cognitions, our memories, and our emotions. The illusion of control can even pop up in social situations, influencing those social cognitive biases we've discussed in this course. Think how survivorship bias causes us to ignore the casualties of past events, memories that we lose track of and which don't survive into the present, because we think our memories are unbiased records of the past. Perhaps fundamental attribution errors or stereotypes perpetuate in our minds because we think we can maintain control of other people simply by how we describe them. Perhaps the strongest illusion of control we have when interacting with others is the empathy gap. Of course, many of us think we can understand the perspectives of others well, but at the end of the day, it's all an illusion. But we're confident that it's not an illusion. Now that you know that your ability to control a great many things in your life is actually an illusion, what will you do about it? Don't feel bad if you can't or won't take the effort to change. That in and of itself is status quo bias at work, because changing may cause enormous amounts of anxious thoughts and feelings, which are unpleasant and something we generally want to avoid. As I mentioned earlier, the status quo bias is the tendency to prefer the current state of affairs to any kind of change, both internally within each of us and externally out in the world. Here's how it works. Wherever you're at, cognitively, emotionally, behaviorally, is what is called your set point. Any deviation from that current state represents a loss. Yep, I set a loss. Even if your psychological state improves, this bias still considers it a loss because it is a different state from your set point. Cumulative prospect theory. The theory claimed that people are generally against losses and losing what is already theirs. Many of our biases discussed in this course generally fall back onto the idea that we need to prevent risk and losses in our lives and decisions. So how does this theory apply to status quo bias? It simply means that a loss of any kind, especially our own lives, is a cost. The cost of changing our minds or deciding to behave in a different way is a loss. The theory implies that our aversion to losing things is the status quo bias at work. The desire to not want to lose what we already have is a compelling reason to keep the things the way they are. And put broadly, encapsulating each of these three ideas that support the status quo bias, we end up in a state of psychological inertia that, according to the laws of physics, is going to require some outside force acting upon it to get us out of that inertia.